Before you guys say anything, I know we're in the middle of building a transmission, but there's been some developments. Yeah, this is gonna be fun. If you guys didn't recognize this is a VQ35HR out of a 2008 Infiniti G35. This was not the way we were planning to go at all. I actually was planning on just getting like a cheap junkyard regular VQ35 DE and throwing that in, but one of my buddies owns a junkyard and he had a couple of these motors, two 3.5s and one 3.7. They were higher mileage, so he didn't really want to sell them to like shops or anything like that, or other like higher paying customers. So he put them on our local group and asked if anybody wanted them for like $300 to $400. So they're all running motors also, so there's no, well, shouldn't be any issues with them. This one in particular ran well enough to run into another car and get all smashed up. We have a little bit of damage on this side because it was a front right collision and the alternator took most of that hit. And unfortunately that transferred a little bit to our front timing cover here, but shouldn't be too bad. This is pretty easy to replace. So we're probably gonna have to find a new one of those and another alternator. Other than that, I wanna just start tearing it apart and see what the inside looks like. Because being that it has 200 and something thousand miles on it, we probably should do a little bit of maintenance on it, especially if we're gonna be banging it off limiter all the time. So I think the first thing we're gonna do is try and check the oil gallery gaskets. If you guys don't know, that's kind of a big issue on pretty much all newer VQ engines. And it's a set of gaskets in the oil passages that are between the timing covers on VQ engines. And the stock gaskets are made of paper and are pretty common that they break and come out of place, and then you lose a lot of oil pressure and causes a whole other set of issues, maybe even blowing up your engine. So that's priority number one, is checking on that and probably replacing them. Second thing, while we're in there, water pump. Unfortunately on these things, the water pump is part of the timing chain and inside the engine. So good job, Nissan. Big fan of that. Luckily they don't go out too often, but being that it has 200,000 miles, probably time to replace it. And other than that, unless we find something worse in there, that should be pretty much it. Other than new like external gaskets, new RTV silicone to seal everything up, and throw it in the Datsun and see if she spins. Oh, that's an issue. The reason it leaked in the patrol on the way home was because the oil pan was smashed here, and I tried to smash it back closed, and in doing that, I kind of blocked our access to the 10mm nuts or bolts there. There's a whole bunch of oil right there that I'm probably gonna spill. Nice and dark, but there's no surprises in here at least. Okay, so we want to take just the front cover off right now, so there should be two 12mm bolts toward the front here. There. And right there. Just checking for any glitter. If this engine had bearing failure at any point, you'd see a whole bunch of sparkly stuff everywhere, but Looks pretty clean. There's a little something here. I think that's silicone. Yep. Looks all right. Now on the front of the engine, there's a bunch of 10, 12, 14s all over the place. So, yeah. Radiator hose, pipe. Needs to not be up in the air for this.
Symphony of crackle.
Bent the bolt. That's never happened before. Huh?
What yoga pose is that?
Frustrated bear. Aha. That was easy.
Whoa.
Yep, looks like an engine. Alright, so if you guys will notice, that gasket is kind of pushed out to the sides of the oil gallery. This is exactly what happens, and eventually the gasket will completely fracture and come out, and then you'll start leaking oil and lose oil pressure because your oil's coming out of there. And also down here, You can see the gasket kind of torn and sticking out there. And toward the bottom here too, you can see the gaskets ripped there and coming out of the oil gallery. So we're gonna need to replace that. This engine was probably fine. Maybe suffered from slightly lower oil pressure than normal, but nothing catastrophic. And judging by like these surfaces, they're still pretty well coated in oil. So it looks like it's still fine. It's got a nice coat of varnish on it though, so oil changes weren't too regular, but good enough. Everything's looking pretty good so far. In order to move forward, we're just gonna do, like I said, some preventive maintenance. Oil gallery gaskets, probably water pump, maybe timing chain and tensioners. Depends if we have the budget for it. So the reason that this video wasn't the last part to putting the transmission back together was because this is an HR motor and the bell housing pattern is actually different than standard DEs. In case you're wondering, it does sort of bolt up, but not really. So you have four of the bolts on top line up. Those are still the same. And even one of the bottom ones still fits on. But the starter location just doesn't work. The oil pan on the HRs being bigger is kind of in the way of where the DE starter would go. So I was actually thinking this might work if you would cut off this edge of the oil pan on the HR, but I don't know if I want to do that yet. I mean, this was like a $300 motor, but I don't know if I'm willing to commit to that yet. And also the crank sensor location doesn't really work. This is where it goes on the HR motor, and this is not where it goes on the DE motor. But this isn't a huge deal. I mean, a carbide bit on a rotary tool or Dremel would take care of this pretty easily. I also had to remove the dowel pins in the block to let the bell housing bolt up. That's also not a huge deal. It makes it more difficult to install your transmission and line it up with the clutch, and also to line up all your bolts and stuff. It's not a deal breaker. I've run an engine and transmission without the dowels before. It still runs fine. Like I said, it just makes it more difficult to install the two together. Other than that, there's half the bolts just don't line up to anything. But those top four is probably enough to hold it together. That being said, I don't think I want to half-ass this. I came across a guy's video called Cam Wilson, and he did a little bit of a walkthrough on how to put this bell housing on a newer transmission. So a JK40C, which is basically the same thing as a CD009, but that's what came in everything with the HR motors. So 2008 350Z G35 and everything after that. So 370Zs, G37s, all that stuff. They're actually pretty much the same, except for the input shaft being a little different between each one. So he actually, I was able to contact him, and he has a spare bell housing from a JK40. So I think what I'm gonna do is try to purchase that from him, and then all we should need after that is a 90mm main shaft bearing or input shaft bearing, because the DE actually has a 100mm input shaft bearing, and it's also 25mm wide, whereas the JK bearing is 23mm wide. So this all should work if I just get a 90mm bearing and then make a 2mm spacer for that bearing to sit on the input shaft of the DE. And then the JK40C bell housing should bolt right up to the back half of our CD009. We'll see how that goes. In conclusion, we're still making pretty good progress here. There wasn't anything catastrophically wrong with our engine. Our transmission that we already invested a bunch of time and money into should still work. It's just a matter of figuring that out and adapt, improvise, overcome kind of thing. Yeah, sometimes you make plans and other stuff comes up and you just can't pass on it. So that I was only planning to purchase a DE for, you know, the same amount of money, $300-400 from a junkyard. I was just gonna go grab it from a self-service yard myself, but my buddy had an HR just sitting there for the same price. So why not? You know, this is a much better engine. This is like peak performance as far as VQ engines go. It complicates things a little bit, but it makes it more fun, right? So stay tuned and see if we can make this whole thing work together in our yellow Datsun, and see if we can get to a drag and drift and maybe crash some stuff. See you guys.